And we are back once again with another one. This time we're going to talk about Khamzat versus Paulo Costa in the upcoming pay-per-view of UFC 294 live in Abu Dhabi, which is going to be great because if you're watching it in the West Coast like I am, well, guess what? You're going to be able to watch it in the morning time and then have the entire Saturday to yourself, or maybe watch other fights that are going on that day. But not only are we going to talk about Paulo Costa and Khamzat Chimaev, in particular, I'm going to talk to you about why the UAE has given Khamzat Chimaev citizenship. And it has a lot to do with being able to fight in America. And of course, it definitely has a lot to do with his friendship with none other than the Chechnyan dictator, Ramzan Kadyrov, who is also, by the way, if you guys are a little bit illiterate in the geopolitical sphere of things, is an ally of Vladimir Putin. I'm going to go into a little bit of history with Ramzan Kadyrov in a little bit and how all it is ties. But as you know, a lot of it has to deal with Ukraine and the conflict going on over there and the lines that are drawn in the sand with the United States on one side and Russia on the other side, and then with Ukraine being an ally of the United States and Russia right now being a contrasting interest to Western counterparts. So before we go into the kicks and punches, let's talk geopolitics of Paulo Costa and Khamzat Chimaev. So Khamzat Chimaev has been granted citizenship in Abu Dhabi. Now, what exactly does that mean? Does that mean that he gets the same rights and privileges as, let's say, a regular, normal Emirati that is born local, native, and has a passport in that particular land? Well, my answer is probably not. And in only by paper, he is an Emirati citizen. And what do I mean by the privileges? Well, maybe perhaps he's not going to be able to buy a building off of an Emirati if he wishes to, if he ever gets to be in that type of level of money where he can just buy buildings, sort of like what Floyd Mayweather does. I think the guy goes out and buys buildings and businesses and whatnot and everything in between. But those are some of the things that he can't do. Another thing that he can't do, he also can't, let's say, run for public office. I mean, they're a monarch, so I don't think that has any, sense of meritocracy and a type of politicians that they let in their particular sphere of government and influence. But nevertheless, he has the same privileges as any other normal Emirati citizen, which is good enough to, guess what, be able to fight in the United States. And why is that significant? Well, for those of you that don't know, the Emiratis have a stake in the UFC, just like the Saudis. As you guys know, the Saudis are fallen into this whole thing. And by the way, I'm going to go into a religious aspect of it too when it comes to, let's say, Islamic prophecies of the end days. I'm going to go into that in a little bit, along with Ramzan Kadyrov and his history. So when you are an Emirati citizen, right, you have the privileges of an American citizen, meaning that you can travel freely in the free world and all its allies and everything that is involved in that sphere of things, i.e. what people call the New World Order. Some may call it the UN for official sake. Some call it the Council of Foreign Relations. All of those things, all correlated in this matter. So Khamzat has been having visa issues coming to the United States to fight. This is why you haven't been able to see him. Why? Because the guy loves the fight. If you guys remember in the pandemic days of the Fight Island Abu Dhabi events, Khamzat was fighting almost every week. And then on top of that, he would want another one and another one. And then eventually the train just started stopping, especially right after the Gilbert Burns fight. And then, of course, after that, he went on to fight Kevin Holland and finish him emphatically within the first round of submission. So after that, we never got to see him since. And perhaps maybe a lot of that has to deal with the effective visa ban and issues that comes with, let's say, Russian citizens. So he says he no longer wants to rep Sweden. Part of the things that he says is because they are a highly socialist country to the point where they do tax you heavily. And if you're a UFC star and a sportsman like Khamzat Chimaev, you would imagine the level of pay that you would have to give up to the Swedish government as a Swedish citizen and as a resident. So it was a multitude of reasons as to why they chose to give Khamzat this particular opportunity. So now that the UFC, and I was going back to the Emirati about they have a stake in the UFC, right? So the fact that the Emiratis have a stake in the UFC, that means that they want Khamzat to be able to fight even outside of the Emirates, which means that, let's say, if he gets to have a title fight, which is on the horizon, eventually it's going to happen. It's either going to be with Sean Strickland, or it's either going to be with Israel Adesanya, or anybody that is up there in the 185 division, maybe even with Dricus du Plessis. Now imagine how great that would be, right? But then imagine if they had to put the fight in South Africa, and maybe they have affiliations with America and not with Russia, and perhaps that would have been an issue. So now they just alleviated a lot of these things through Khamzat Chimaev having citizenship. Okay, so now that I explained to you why it's important for Khamzat Chimaev to have citizenship with the Emiratis and how that's going to help him get fights in the United States and venues such as Las Vegas, Chicago, New York, Miami, Los Angeles, all the top cities where you want to hold fight events, but especially in Vegas, right? Which, as we know, is the capital of the fight world in America in particular. Okay, so now that we understand and establish that, let's talk about who Ramzan Kadyrov is. Why is he such a bad guy, and why does he constantly post Instagram pictures of him and Khamzat, sparring with Khamzat, making it look like that he beats Khamzat up, when in reality it's just Khamzat perhaps maybe fearing for his life? And how does this relate to, let's say, the Wagner Group, the guy that got killed recently in a plane crash, the leader of the Wagner Group, called the chef, Prigozhin or something like that his name is. So Ramzan Kadyrov was part of the Chechen resistance movement back in the 90s, him and his father, and the 90s to the 2000s. He was a former jihadist who eventually became partners with Russia. And then after he became partners with Russia, he was given what you would call in a very similar position as what governors would, let's say, take in a certain region of the United States, right? In that type of position, but in a Russian way. So basically, he is the Russian Muslim president, because obviously Russia is a predominantly Christian Orthodox country ran by Vladimir Putin. So as a result, they do have a Muslim population that live in the Caucasus areas, in the Caucasus Mountains, in the Dagestani parts of Russia, in the Chechen parts of Russia, in the stands that are all over the place, right? Which Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, all these former Soviet states that have a Muslim heritage behind them. Ramzan Kadyrov is damn near the leader and the commander of that particular region, appointed by none other than Vladimir Putin. This was as far back as 2004, when he was very young. So that's basically who Ramzan Kadyrov is, and now he has this reputation of, let's say, throwing certain people off rooftops. Let's just say people that side with the Jussie Smollett and the Elton Johns of the world, and how I can say it so lightly, right? He throws them off the roof. He goes out and kills dissidents, according to news. Now, I don't know if I can verify that, if that's real or not, but this is what they say. But nonetheless, this is a problem and a controversy when Ramzan Kadyrov is friends with many fighters. A lot of Chechen fighters that fight in the UFC and even in boxing with the likes of Arthur Beterbiev. So this is a very influential man. He loves MMA, he loves combat sports, and he loves all these guys that come from his country to dominate in that sport. And it's a great way for them to create a propaganda for their military, which literally is what everybody does and uses MMA for. Because let's face it, what is MMA? MMA is an entertainment spectacle sport, but it is also a sport that helps promote national defense. And in particular, whether it would be in the United States or Russia or elsewhere in the world. So that's Ramzan Kadyrov in a nutshell. Now, how does this relate with, let's say, the Russians and the Saudis? Well, right now, the Saudis are becoming friends and really cozy with the Russians because for whatever reason, the United States and Saudi Arabia has a little bit of their rift going on, and some may blame the Biden administration for that. A lot of people say that under Trump, the Saudis and the Americans had a good relationship. Of course, you know documentedly well about the relationship with George Bush and none other than the Saudis and their families and how they tie into the whole fiasco and the conspiracy of 9/11. Not that I'm saying that any of that is true or anything to that extent, but these are, these are the correlations and connections to these things. So now, the Saudis, as you know, is also getting into the sports business, just like the Emiratis, but doing it on a bigger scale. If you notice, the Saudis went out and basically bought all the best soccer players in the world, created their own golf league that is rival to the PGA, probably even has more budget than them, puts their foot into Formula One racing, puts their hold into boxing, and the likes that you've seen right now with the Tyson Fury fights, with the Francis Ngannou, and even far back as when you had the Super 6 series. If you guys remember when Callum Smith won the 168-pound championship in the Super 6 series that was held in Saudi Arabia, where he fought, I believe, George Groves for the finals. And then, lo and behold, they go and probably try to get into MMA as well, which is, well, there's only one conglomerate giant in the MMA world right now, and obviously that's the UFC, right? Well, the Saudis, don't be surprised if the Saudis will either do business with the with the UFC in the United States, or they will try to rival them, but I don't see that happening because of the amount of resources that they can have to literally wipe out the UFC if they wish. So what I think is going to happen is perhaps maybe Dana White is going to try to cozy up with the Saudis just as much as he cozies up with the Emiratis and tries to build a relationship there, because guess what? There's one thing that you got to learn about business, right? And I've heard this from the YouTuber Jesse on Fire, who, by the way, constantly shouts me out in his shows, reads all my comments every time that I'm there. He says something to the effect that you cannot have enemies in business. It's not conducive to your gains that you're trying to make in the business world or whatever it is that you're trying to do. So therefore, he feels that this is not the right path, and I believe that any smart businessman such as Dana White would probably take the same decision in terms of whether they want to make enemies with the Saudis or not. And what's the proof of this? You look at the Francis Ngannou fight, they're not even opposing that. They're not talking down on it, because usually if Dana White sees a fighter that gets out of a contract, he will usually go and slag this person off online or whatever interviews that he can find to basically diminish this person and their product, i.e. Oscar De La Hoya or Frank Shamrock or Randy Couture, all these different interactions that he's had in his business career with the UFC. So, yes, I truly believe that that is the next course of action they're going to take with the Saudis, because they can't let the Saudis take over MMA, and guess what? If you can't beat them, join them. So why would the UFC, or I'm sorry, why would the Saudi Arabia not want to work with a UFC, a proven entity, a top name in the industry, and they can just go and add on to the investments that the Emiratis, that the Endeavor Management Group has, and all the other people in Hollywood that have invested their money into this company known as the UFC, Zuffa, and Endeavor. So, speaking of the Saudis and Emiratis, I'm going to leave it off with this. I remember something to the effect of reading the Hadith saying that in the end days won't come until the Arabs start competing with each other for the highest buildings. And guess what? When you look at the Emiratis, when you look at the Bahrainis, when you look at the Qataris, when you look at the Saudis, you look at all the people that are part of the Khaliji Arab tribe of the world, guess what they're all doing? They all have oil money, and they're competing with each other for the highest buildings in the world. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, once said that this is a sign of the end days. Of course, so all my other Christian and Jewish counterparts out there that understand about prophecies and the end times, I think you know where I'm going with this, but it's just interesting to know that that was documented. And not only are the Saudis and the Emiratis and all the other Arabs competing with each other for the highest buildings, they're also competing with each other, or maybe even working with each other to build the biggest sports network that they can possibly make in various disciplines, whether that would be F1 Formula Racing, MMA, boxing, golf, soccer, maybe even American football, if they can even touch that particular circumference of the world. But nonetheless, that is the reality of this entire fiasco that you're seeing right now with Khamzat Chimaev going into his fight with Paulo Costa. Now, let's go into the kicks and punches. I gave you all the exciting stuff that deals with this particular subject. Now, let's go into the martial arts of things. How I see this fight, it's going to be very difficult for Khamzat Chimaev to take Paulo Costa down, meaning that he would have to strike with him for a little bit. Now, is he going to get him down eventually? The answer is yes. 100% he's going to take him down. But when will he do it? I think he will do it at a much later time than people would expect. A whole lot later in the fight than, let's say, Kevin Holland. That's for damn sure. I think that Paulo Costa has great takedown defense. He's got decent striking. Khamzat Chimaev is going to have to walk in the line of fire with Paulo Costa with the striking, but eventually he's going to get in there, close the distance, get his takedown, and eventually grind him out to a submission or maybe a ground and pound finish. That is my official prediction for that fight. This is the official report for Khamzat Chimaev's citizenship with the UAE, and I've given you guys a little bit of some Islamic knowledge on the side, along with some current event news, and then giving you some biography of different world leaders that are involved in current world conflicts at the current time. Why would you not like and subscribe to a channel like this? So, like and subscribe. I'll see you guys again when we go out and enjoy the fights.